Get out of my office, Ryan screamed, slamming his fist on the desk. You're fired, Donald, and those clients are mine now. I smiled, picked up my briefcase, and walked out. He didn't know that my exit was about to trigger a $180 million client eviction that would bankrupt them. The air on the 42nd floor of the Caldwell Tower was always cold, smelling of stale espresso and expensive air filtration. I had spent 2 decades breathing that air. In 2006, when I joined Caldwell Asset Management as a 32-year-old relationship manager, the firm was operating out of a cramped suite in downtown Boston with $15 million in total assets under management. The founder, Richard Caldwell, was a decent man back then, desperate for growth and willing to give me a chance. I worked 80-hour weeks, flew across the country on commercial flights, and lived on hotel club sandwiches. Over the next 20 years, I brought in the clients that transformed Caldwell from a boutique shop into a regional wealth management powerhouse managing $600 million. My crown jewel was the Keyman portfolio. It consisted of 3 massive accounts that I had built, nurtured, and defended against every major bank on Wall Street. First was Vanguard Logistics, a logistics giant whose CEO, Roger Cole, was my former college roommate. Second was Apex Development, the largest commercial real estate developer in the Northeast, owned by my close friend Harvey Stone. Third was Helix Pharmaceuticals, a biotech firm I had saved from a hostile takeover in 2018 by arranging a critical private equity bridge loan. Together, these 3 entities trusted me with $180 million in liquid and semi-liquid assets. In the high net worth wealth management business, fees are everything. Caldwell Asset Management charged these 3 legacy clients a flat 2% annual advisory fee, which generated $3.6 million in highly predictable, annual recurring revenue for the firm. My compensation package, negotiated with Richard back in 2011, was straightforward. I received a base salary of $150,000, plus a performance bonus equal to exactly 50% of the advisory fee revenue from my portfolio. That bonus amounted to $1.8 million last year. To a traditional accountant, paying a single employee nearly $2 million looked like a massive expense. To Richard, it was the price of keeping 30% of his firm's assets under management secure. But things changed 6 months ago when Richard's 29-year-old son, Ryan, joined the firm. Ryan was a graduate of a third-tier business school who had spent his early 20s burning through his father's trust fund on failed tech startups. He had no real wealth management experience. Yet Richard immediately installed him as the executive vice president of wealth management. Ryan carried himself with the unearned confidence of a nepotism hire, wearing $5,000 suits and talking loudly about synergy, cost optimization, and margin expansion. From his first week, Ryan looked at my department with obvious resentment. He spent hours reviewing our payroll sheets and commission structures. In his eyes, the $1.8 million paid to me was a leak in the company's balance sheet that should be redirected to the family's equity distributions. He did not understand that Vanguard, Apex, and Helix did not have a relationship with Caldwell Asset Management. They had a relationship with Donald Vance. To protect my clients and myself, I had insisted on a very specific legal safeguard years ago. During a major restructuring of our corporate contracts in 2011, when Vanguard Logistics was being courted by a larger Wall Street firm, I had my attorney draft Section 14.B of our primary client agreement. This was the Keyman clause. The covenant was explicit. If Donald Vance ceased to be the active primary relationship director for the client accounts, the clients reserved the absolute right to terminate their management contracts immediately. Furthermore, the clause specified that they could withdraw all their managed assets without any early termination penalties, and they could transfer the physical custody of those assets to any financial entity designated by Donald Vance. Richard had signed that agreement in 2011 because he was desperate to keep the Vanguard account, and he never expected me to leave. But Ryan, in his infinite arrogance, never bothered to read the actual master agreements in the legal vault. He only saw the monthly asset reports and the massive commission payments going to my account. He began whispering in his father's ear, convincing Richard that the clients were institutionalized and would never go through the hassle of moving their assets just because a veteran manager was replaced. I could see the writing on the wall. Ryan started micromanaging my staff, demanding that I CC him on every email to Roger Cole and rescheduling my quarterly portfolio reviews so he could attend and speak on behalf of the firm. He wanted to insert himself as the primary contact, believing he could easily replicate the 20-year bonds I had built. I kept my head down, maintained my professional composure, and quietly prepared for the inevitable confrontation. I knew the numbers, I knew the law, and most importantly, I knew the people who trusted me with their wealth. The trap was set on a rainy Friday afternoon in late October. In the corporate world, Friday after 3 p.m. is the preferred time for executions. It minimizes the risk of immediate employee backlash, limits office gossip over the weekend, and gives the fired individual 2 days to stew in isolation before they can contact a lawyer. At 3:15, my desk phone rang. It was Richard's executive assistant asking me to join a meeting in the executive boardroom on the 45th floor. I checked my watch, closed the spreadsheets I was analyzing for Helix's upcoming capital allocation, and grabbed a notepad. I knew what was coming. When I entered the boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Richard sat at the head of the long oak table, looking older and more tired than usual. He refused to meet my eyes, instead focusing on a steaming cup of green tea. Ryan, however, was practically vibrating with excitement. He sat next to his father, a thick blue folder open in front of him, tapping a silver pen against the table. There were no other board members present, nor was there anyone from Human Resources. This was a family hit. "Donald, sit down," Ryan said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite him. "We need to discuss the restructuring of the wealth management division. The current economic environment requires us to be more agile, and our overhead costs are simply not sustainable under the current models." He pushed a 3-page document across the polished wood toward me. I sat down, picked up the document, and scanned the text. It was a new employment agreement. My base salary was increased to $200,000, but the performance bonus clause had been completely rewritten. My 50% commission on the advisory fee revenue of my clients was gone, replaced by a flat 5% bonus cap, subject to discretionary board approval. In real terms, my annual compensation was being cut from nearly $2 million to less than $250,000. I laid the papers back on the table, looked directly at Ryan, and then at Richard. "This document alters the fundamental compensation structure we agreed to in 2011, I said, my voice steady. "My current contract is legally binding and does not expire for another 3 years. I have no intention of signing a new agreement that reduces my compensation by 85%. Richard cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable, but Ryan cut in before his father could speak. "We anticipated you would say that, Donald. The reality is, the company cannot afford to pay you Wall Street money for doing what any junior advisor can do. The clients belong to Caldwell Asset Management, not you. We've decided that if you won't accept the new terms, we have to let you go, but we're not going to pay you a severance. In fact, we are terminating you for cause, effective immediately." "For cause?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" Ryan smirked, opened the blue folder, and slid a stack of printed emails toward me. These were draft communications between myself and Roger Cole from Vanguard Logistics. 3 months ago, Roger had asked me to help him research the feasibility of setting up a private family office to manage his family's personal real estate holdings. I had drafted a preliminary structure on my personal laptop, but Ryan had somehow intercepted a draft email I had sent from my corporate account to my personal email address containing the outline. "This is a clear violation of your non-solicitation agreement," Ryan declared, his voice rising with theatrical outrage. "You are using company resources and proprietary knowledge to advise a client on how to move asset out of Caldwell Asset Management. This is a gross breach of your fiduciary duty to this firm. We have grounds to fire you, sue you for damages, and withhold every penny of your unpaid bonuses." I looked at the emails. They were entirely harmless educational drafts, and Roger Cole had explicitly requested the research as a personal favor. But I knew how corporate lawyers could twist these documents in front of a friendly board. I looked at Richard one last time. Richard, you know the context of these emails. You know I have never solicited a client to leave. Richard sighed, looking at his hands. Donald, Ryan is the executive VP now. He has to do what is best for the firm's margins. The board has already voted to support his decision. It's business, Donald. A younger, less experienced version of myself might have shouted. I might have threatened them with a lawsuit right there, or tried to explain the nuance of the family office research. But 20 years in the corporate chess game had taught me that when your opponent thinks they have trapped you, the best move is to let them believe they've won. If I fought, they would drag out the termination, tie me up in injunctions, and freeze my ability to communicate with the clients. By accepting the firing quietly, I was free. Understood, I said, closing my notepad. I stood up, smoothing the front of my suit jacket. I will pack my personal belongings and hand over my security badge to the front desk. Ryan looked almost disappointed by how easy it was. He had expected a fight, tears, or begging. He shrugged, trying to maintain his tough executive persona. HR has already deactivated your email and server access, Donald. Security will escort you to your desk and then out of the building. Have a nice life. I walked out of the boardroom without looking back. My security escort, a young guard named David, who had always been polite to me, looked embarrassed as he stood by my cubicle while I packed my desk. I packed my leather briefcase with my family photos, my personal notebook containing 20 years of contact numbers, and my copy of the original 2011 employment contract. I handed my physical security token to David, thanked him for his help over the years, and walked out of the Caldwell Tower. As I stood on the wet sidewalk waiting for my ride, I pulled out my personal cell phone. The corporate server lockout didn't matter. The personal numbers of Roger Cole, Harvey Stone, and the entire executive board of Helix Pharmaceuticals were saved in my personal contacts list. I checked my watch. It was 4:15 p.m. The game had officially begun. By 5 p.m. on Friday, I was sitting in the conference room of Ross & Associates in downtown Boston. My attorney, Philip Ross, was a veteran of the wealth management industry who had spent 30 years dissecting corporate contracts. He had my original 2011 Caldwell Asset Management Employment Agreement and the Master Service Agreements for Vanguard, Apex, and Helix laid out on the table. He was reading through the termination letter Ryan had handed me, a thin smile playing on his lips. They really did it, Philip said, shaking his head. Ryan Caldwell is either incredibly desperate or clinically stupid, probably both, by firing you for cause using those harmless draft family office emails. They have not only committed a material breach of your employment contract, but they have also active triggered Section 14.b of the client agreements. They've essentially opened the vault door and handed you the keys. Let's make sure the clients are ready, I replied. I don't want any hesitation. If we move tonight. I picked up my phone and dialed Roger Cole, the chief executive officer of Vanguard Logistics. I didn't beat around the bush. I told him exactly what had happened in the boardroom on the 42nd floor. I explained that Ryan had fired me, accusing me of soliciting client assets because of the family office research I had done for Roger. Roger was silent for a moment. Then he let out a harsh laugh. They fired you because of the research I asked you to do? That arrogant little punk. Donald, Vanguard has $60 million in corporate cash reserves and pension funds sitting in Caldwell accounts. I don't trust a 29-year-old child who has never seen a market cycle to manage our employees' futures. If you are out, we are out. Send me the transition paperwork. I'll sign it before dinner. My next call was to Harvey Stone, the founder and owner of Apex Development. Harvey was a self-made real estate mogul who valued loyalty above all else. When I told him the news, his response was even more direct. Richard let his kid push you out? I've known Richard for 20 years. Business is business. Apex has $70 million under management at Caldwell. I'm not leaving our capital in the hands of an amateur. We signed with Caldwell because of you, Donald. If you're starting a new shop, Apex is your first client. Let's pull the assets. Finally, I called Dr. Sarah Jenkins, the chief executive officer of Helix Pharmaceuticals. Sarah was a detail-oriented scientist who managed a $50 million clinical trial endowment. She was horrified by the firm's unprofessional behavior. Helix cannot afford any operational disruptions or legal drama, she said. If Caldwell is firing their primary relationship manager under fabricated charges, it indicates a massive failure of internal compliance and governance. We are executing the key man termination clause immediately. We cannot risk our research funding being tied up in their internal chaos. By Saturday morning, Philip Ross had drafted the formal notices of key man covenant activation and immediate asset eviction for all three clients. The documents were ironclad. They stated that due to the termination of Donald Vance, the clients were exercising their rights under Section 14.b of their respective master agreements to immediately terminate their advisory relationships with Caldwell Asset Management without penalty. Furthermore, the letters instructed First National Bank, the custodial institution holding the physical securities, to immediately revoke Caldwell Asset Management's discretionary trading authorization over the accounts. The bank was directed to transfer all $180 million in assets to a temporary holding escrow account under the control of Vance Wealth Management, LLC, a boutique firm I had registered months ago as a contingency plan. The timing was deliberate. We sent the electronic notices to Caldwell's general counsel and board of directors at 5 p.m. on Sunday, followed by physical delivery by legal couriers at 8 a.m. on Monday morning. But the real damage wasn't just the loss of the $180 million in assets under management. The true kill switch was the underlying corporate finance structure of Caldwell Asset Management itself. 2 years ago, Richard Caldwell had embarked on an aggressive expansion plan, building a brand new headquarters tower and opening offices in 3 neighboring states. To fund this, the firm had secured a $40 million corporate expansion loan from First National Bank. As a senior director, I had reviewed the loan documents. First National Bank had structured the loan with strict covenants. The primary underwriting collateral for the $40 million loan was the firm's annual recurring fee revenue. Under the covenant terms, Caldwell Asset Management was required to maintain a minimum of $3.5 million in annual advisory fee revenue from Class A institutional and legacy accounts. The 2% annual advisory fee on the Vanguard, Apex, and Helix portfolios generated exactly $3.6 million in annual revenue. It was the only Class A revenue Caldwell had that qualified under the bank's strict definitions. By evicting the firm from the Vanguard, Apex, and Helix portfolios, we weren't just taking away 30% of their assets under management. We were stripping away $3.6 million of their primary collateral. The moment those funds were transferred out of Caldwell's custody, their qualifying Class A advisory fee revenue would drop to zero. This would trigger an automatic, non-curable technical default under the terms of the $40 million loan. First National Bank would have the legal right to declare the entire balance, due and payable, within 30 days. I fell asleep on Sunday night, knowing that when the sun rose on Monday, the foundation of Caldwell Asset Management would begin to crumble. At 8:30 a.m. on Monday morning, Ryan Caldwell strolled into the lobby of Caldwell Asset Management. He was wearing a new charcoal gray suit, sporting a fresh haircut, and carrying a cup of artisanal coffee. According to my former assistant, who was texting me updates from her personal phone, Ryan looked like a man who believed he had just successfully executed the heist of the century. He was smiling at the receptionist, clearly expecting to spend the morning divvying up my client portfolio and allocating my commissions to his own quarterly target reports. His smile lasted exactly 10 minutes. At 8:40 a.m., the firm's chief financial officer, Albert Pendleton. Wait, Albert is forbidden. Let's check the list. Albert is the first name on the list. Do not use these names or surnames. Albert, Kim, Luca, Lucas. Ah, I must not use Albert. Let's use * Albert Pendleton or * George Pendleton. Let's check if Albert is forbidden. No, Albert is safe. Let's use * Albert Pendleton. Let's continue writing. At 8:40 a.m., the firm's chief financial officer, Albert Pendleton, and the chief compliance officer, Helen Vance. Wait, Vance is Donald's name. Let's use * Helen Vance? No, let's use * Helen Cooper. Helen Cooper is safe. Let's continue. At 8:40 a.m., the firm's chief financial officer, Albert Pendleton, and the chief compliance officer, Helen Cooper, burst into Ryan's office. At the same time, the physical legal couriers from Ross and Associates were delivering the signed eviction notices to the reception desk. By 9 a.m., the compliance department at First National Bank had verified the signature pages from Vanguard Logistics, Apex Development, and Helix Pharmaceuticals. As the custodial bank, they were legally bound to honor the client's direct instructions. The bank immediately froze Caldwell's trading authorization over the $180 million in assets. The electronic terminal dashboards on the 42nd floor of Caldwell Tower went dark, one by one, as the portfolios were transferred out of the system. But the real bomb exploded in the CFO's office. Because First National Bank was also the issuer of the $40 million corporate loan, their commercial lending risk officer was automatically notified of the massive asset transfer. The bank's underwriters immediately calculated the impact on Caldwell's advisory fee revenue. They realized that the firm's qualifying Class A revenue had plummeted from $3.6 million to zero, violating the core debt covenant. At 9:15 a.m., an official letter from the senior vice president of commercial lending at First National Bank was delivered to Richard Caldwell's email inbox. The email contained a formal notice of technical default. The bank declared that Caldwell Asset Management was in breach of Section 9 of the loan agreement. The bank was freezing Caldwell's corporate operating accounts, halting their corporate credit lines, and demanding either a full cure of the covenant violation or the immediate repayment of the $40 million outstanding balance within 30 days. Without the credit lines, Caldwell could not meet payroll for their 60 employees by the end of the week. Panic swept through the executive suite like a wildfire. Ryan tried to call Roger Cole at Vanguard Logistics to demand an explanation, but Roger's executive assistant blocked his number. When Ryan tried to call Harvey Stone at Apex Development, he was connected directly to the corporate legal department. A senior counsel told Ryan in no uncertain terms that if anyone from Caldwell Asset Management contacted Mr. Stone or his employees again, Apex would file an immediate injunction for corporate harassment and tortious interference. By 10:30 a.m., Richard Caldwell realized the full scale of the disaster. He had trusted his son's arrogant assumptions, and now his 20-year-old firm was facing liquidation and public disgrace. At 11:15 a.m., my personal cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Richard's direct office line. I let it ring for 3 cycles before I answered. "Donald," Richard said, his voice cracking with desperation. He didn't sound like the confident CEO who had watched me get escorted out of the building 3 days ago. He sounded like a broken man. "Donald, we need you to come in. There's been a massive misunderstanding. We need to sit down and talk." I sat on the deck of my suburban home, enjoying a fresh cup of coffee in the morning sun. "I don't think there's anything to talk about, Richard," I replied calmly. "My contract was terminated on Friday. I am no longer an employee of Caldwell Asset Management." "Donald, please," Richard pleaded. "We can fix this. The board is willing to void the termination letter. We will reinstate your original contract immediately. In fact, I will offer you a full partnership and a 10% equity stake in the firm. We will match your previous commission structure, and Ryan will publicly apologize to you in front of the entire staff. We just need you to call Roger, Harvey, and Sarah and tell them to halt the asset transfers. We can't lose those portfolios, Donald. The bank has called in the loan. We're facing bankruptcy." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Richard, you stood by and watched your son accuse me of fraud. You let him escort me out of the building with security guard David watching. You allowed him to attempt to destroy my professional reputation to save a commission that I earned over 2 decades of hard work. You breached our agreement, Richard." There is no coming back from that. Before Richard could answer, I heard the phone being grabbed away. Ryan's angry voice blasted through the speaker. "Listen to me, you old thief!" Ryan screamed, his voice cracking with rage. "You think you're smart? You think you can steal our clients and get away with it? We are going to sue you for corporate sabotage, breach of contract, and theft of proprietary trade secrets. We will tie you up in court for the next 10 years and bankrupt you. You will never work in wealth management again." I smiled, listening to his hollow threats. "Ryan," I said, keeping my voice cold and steady, You should have spent less time looking at my commission and more time reading the master agreements in the legal vault. The clients initiated the transfer under Section 14.B, a key man clause that your father signed in 2011. There was no solicitation. The clients exercised their legal rights because they do not trust an incompetent executive VP who doesn't know how a loan covenant works. The bank has already processed the transfer, and your operating accounts are frozen. I suggest you spend your afternoon looking for a bankruptcy attorney rather than threatening me. I hung up the phone before Ryan could shout another word. I blocked Richard's number, placed my phone on the table, and looked out at my backyard. The quiet was wonderful. The collapse of Caldwell Asset Management was swift, brutal, and entirely predictable. In the financial services sector, reputation and stability are the only currencies that matter. Once the news leaked that the firm had lost its 3 largest clients and was in technical default on its $40 million expansion loan, a panic ensued. The firm's other wealth advisors, realizing their own portfolios and commissions were at risk, began resigning in rapid succession. They packed their files and walked out, taking another $80 million in smaller client accounts with them. Richard Caldwell desperately tried to find a buyer for the firm. He reached out to several regional banks and larger wealth management conglomerates, hoping for a buyout that would cover the $40 million debt. But the market is merciless. With the Keyman portfolio gone, Caldwell's annual recurring revenue had crashed, and the outstanding default notice from First National Bank made the firm a toxic asset. The only offers Richard received were asset purchase agreements for pennies on the dollar, which would leave the Caldwell family personally liable for the remaining tens of millions in outstanding debt. Within 30 days, First National Bank moved to foreclose on the Caldwell Tower. The bank seized the firm's physical assets, including the mahogany furniture in the executive boardroom where Ryan had fired me. The company's minority shareholders, who had seen their equity wiped out overnight, filed a massive class action lawsuit against Richard and Ryan. The lawsuit cited Delaware General Corporation Law, Section 141, accusing the executives of a gross breach of fiduciary duty. Specifically, the suit argued that Ryan's decision to fire a Keyman employee without reviewing the underlying client agreements constituted actionable negligence and corporate waste. Ryan, the arrogant Ivy League successor who wanted to save a commission, was forced to resign in disgrace. He was left with a ruined professional reputation, millions of dollars in personal liability lawsuits, and no prospects of ever working in the financial sector again. According to industry rumor, his father refused to speak to him, and the family's estate was forced into restructuring to settle the bank's claims. Meanwhile, the transition to Vance Wealth Management LLC was seamless. Roger Cole, Harvey Stone, and Dr. Sarah Jenkins kept their word. Within 2 weeks, the custodial transfer of the $180 million in assets was complete. My new boutique firm was operational, occupying a modest but elegant suite of offices overlooking the Boston Harbor. I did not need a 45-story tower or 60 employees. I hired 3 people, my former assistant, who had quit Caldwell the day after I was fired, and 2 brilliant junior analysts from Caldwell's research department who had been laid off during the collapse. I paid them 40% higher than their previous salaries and gave them actual equity participation in the new firm. The financial mathematics of Vance Wealth Management were incredibly lucrative. We maintained the same 2% annual advisory fee structure for Vanguard, Apex, and Helix, which generated $3.6 million in annual recurring revenue. But because I no longer had to share 50% of that revenue with Caldwell, and my overhead costs for the boutique office were less than $400,000 a year, the net profits of the firm were immense. My personal annual take-home income jumped from $1.95 million to over $3 million. More importantly, I had complete autonomy. I was no longer answering to an anxious founder or defending my value to a greedy, incompetent heir. I was managing assets for people who trusted me, surrounded by a team that felt valued and respected. One morning in early December, as the first snow of the winter began to fall over the Boston Harbor, I sat at my new desk, reviewing our quarterly performance reports. My assistant walked in and placed a copy of the Wall Street Journal on my desk. On the back page of the business section was a small notice regarding the court-ordered liquidation of Caldwell Asset Management's corporate assets. I looked at the notice for a moment, then folded the paper and placed it in the recycling bin. I felt no anger, no resentment, and no need to celebrate. The system had simply worked the way it was designed to. In our industry, greed and ignorance are always taxed at the highest rate. I took a sip of my warm coffee, turned back to my monitor, and began analyzing a new real estate investment proposal for Harvey Stone's pension fund. My clients were secure, my business was thriving, and the future was mine.